Great, okay. So welcome everybody. I'm going to hand over first of all for a formal welcome from our head of department, Dr. Jacek Brandt. Thanks very much, Jacek, for coming along.
Thanks, Mary. Hello and a warm welcome to our special event tonight here at UCL Institute of Education. Many of you know me. I'm Jacek Brandt, head of department of curriculum, pedagogy and assessment. And tonight's session is all focused on assessment. A key work of our department, a key element of our department. We're delighted to welcome so many of you to this very special event. The Department of Curriculum, Pedagogy and Assessment is a vibrant hub of research, international, national and local. Teaching in CPA is informed by the research we carry out, and we currently have 5 specialised research centres focusing on teachers, teaching, schools, classrooms and schooling systems, on issues related to early years, especially in China and CPA, and our award-winning centre promoting knowledge about the Holocaust. We also have research and specialist interest groups in mathematics and subject specialism, science and religious education. And today we are launching the newest member, the Educational Assessment Group, or EAG at IOE. Assessment has always been an important part of our work, and here at IOE and our academic staff who have and continue to specialise in this area have made significant contributions to teaching, learning, research and policy. At tonight's event, we are proud to bring together some of the most important names in assessment to discuss its past, present and future, while reflecting on their work, research and contributions to the field. Over the past 18 months, assessment has been rarely out of the news, and this reflects its value, but also demonstrates how much more there is to do in terms of looking at what good assessment actually is and what that might look like in the future. The group's 2 directors, Mary Richardson and Katerina Correa, will be your hosts this evening. The event starts with a brief overview of our vision of the EAG, and we'll move swiftly on to the main event, our 3 panelists and the discussion. Thank you once again for attending tonight, and to those of you unable to make it and watching at a later date. You are very welcome, and we hope to see you all again in the future. Enjoy the event and my best wishes to all of you. So I'll hand over back to Mary.
Thanks so much. I know our head of department, Jacek, has a very, very busy schedule, so I really appreciate your being able to come in and do the official honours to welcome the launch this evening. So I'm going to put up a PowerPoint, but I promise I'm going to be really quick. I'm going to take you through some of the basics to do with what we want the educational assessment group to be, and also how we would love your input and your ideas about it. So I will attempt to share my screen well. And right, just bear with me a minute. Okay. Right, this should look better, okay, to everybody here. So welcome, as I said before, I'm Mary, and together with Katerina, we lead the MA in Education Assessment at UCL's Institute of Education. And basically, it's fair to say that we love all things assessment, and proudly so. We like the nerdiness of it, and also find it consistently interesting because we have different views and different perspectives on assessment, which you'll find out a bit more about tonight. So this is the official launch tonight, and then from here on, you are...
What can I say?
Sorry? Oh, sorry. If you are predisposed to using social media, there is a hashtag there, and we welcome you to use that. So If you're talking or tweeting about us or commenting on, please do feel free to use the hashtag. Okay, so telling you briefly about the centre. This is what it's going to look like. I say centre, sorry, I should use the term. It's the Educational Assessment Group, hence EAG at IOE. I purposefully didn't want it to be called a research group or research centre because I don't want it to be limited to just research. Whilst I think obviously that research is an incredibly important bit of what we do, I also think assessment needs more than that. We need to think about how students are engaging with it. And I mean students right from, the nursery up to higher education and beyond. And I also want to think about how external agents and the assessment industry, for want of a better word, also interacts more with researchers, with academia, and for all of us to have more conversations and really rich conversations about this incredibly important subject. I think it's, for us, it really is at the heart of education. It's the heart of what we do and what we think about. So that's what I envisage the group to be. Obviously, we start small and perfectly formed with myself and Katerina leading the group through, but it's something that we encourage everyone to join. And these are the aims that we have so far. So it's about ensuring we are promoting good practice in assessment, but as a part of what we do when we're promoting teaching, when we're learning, that it's not the add-on, it's part of the whole thing. And our speakers were definitely going to talk to this tonight. I'm also really passionate about engaging people in talking about assessment. So not just teachers and researchers and students, but also parents, the general public, getting people talking to one another about it. If COVID's shown us anything in the last year, what it's shown us is how poor public understanding of assessment often is. And to be honest, that ranges from our politicians right down to the people it's actually happening to. And I think, again, we deserve better. Obviously, I want to promote engagement in learning about assessment too, developing expertise so that people can go out and share that globally. And we can do that via our MA and also our doctoral students. And of course, finally, and it's certainly not least, it's about initiating and sharing what we do. For me, in educational research, it's not about what you're actually doing while you're collecting the research. It's about what can we do with it afterwards to try and affect change, to help us understand things better. So it's about doing a really good job, but being able to use that research, being able to let it help us inform what we do. And so that's our focus going forward. Just to give you an idea of the kind of range of things we're interested in, our MA assessment programme has an intake of, no more than 21 students in any one year. The applications were extremely high this year, and it's been a really difficult decision. We had more than 100 applicants. That's a global intake from people working in policy departments, teachers. To be fair, I've actually got a stand-up comedian registered at the moment as well. So you can see the breadth of background from our students. We also have doctoral candidates too. I know some of them are here tonight joining us. Again, this is where assessment's so interesting. Our doctoral students are looking at things such as comparative judgment, the history of assessment, assessing global education. How is social media portraying assessment? How do midwives assess their learning? How do we assess the education of refugees and look at identity and nursing assessment? So that's the breadth of it. We hope to develop as much research and consultancy as we can to inform teaching and learning. And of course, the things we have been involved in that many of you may well know about is that Tina and myself led the team from UCL this year who were reported out on the TIMS International Study of Maths and Science for England. Myself and my colleague Sandy Leeton-Gray have just started a 2.5-year project with Pearson PTE Academic looking at the future of artificially intelligent exams and looking at what is the future. And also Katerina and I are involved in different organisations, and we would love to get involved with other organisations and anyone who's interested. And just to give you a flavour of that, the kind of organisations that the group is linked to, and we're linked to, are qualifications organisations, awarding bodies there you can see, and then obviously specialist organisations such as PSGB, the Association for Science Education, and more. So please join us. If you haven't already, it's really simple. Just send me an email. If you put EAG in the title, that's all you need to know. I will sign you up. I promise we won't bombard you with hundreds of emails. The other thing I'm interested in is, have you got ideas you'd like to present? Are you interested in assessment too? Would you like to present a seminar going forward with us, with some of our students, other things you'd like to be involved in? As I said at the beginning, we love assessment. We're slightly obsessed with it. So email us and we're really happy to talk. Once again, thank you so much. We've been bowled over by the number of people who've registered today and the fact that it's a global audience. So I'm moving on to the main event because this is what you're here for, and it will be a great discussion. Thank you all for coming, and I will hand over to my colleague now, Katerina, to introduce our panelists.
So hello and a warm welcome to you all. My name is Caterina Correia and I'm a lecturer in education working with Mary. Well, she has introduced us already. So my role today is to introduce you to our speakers, and wow, we have 3 internationally renowned experts in educational assessment. I think really introducing them to you is quite a redundant activity because you will all know them. But what I will do is just, tell a few words introducing each of them. And I will follow the order of the lineup for their presentation before we actually head on to the discussion. So I will start with Professor Gordon Stobart, whose work has been incredibly influential across an impressive range of areas in assessment. Gordon is Emeritus Professor in Education at UCL Institute of Education. And before joining the IOE, he worked with different exam boards, the National Council for Vocational Qualifications and QCA. Gordon is a founder member of the Assessment Reform Group, and over the last 20 years has worked in developing assessment for learning, both in the UK and overseas. So a warm welcome to you, Gordon. I will now introduce our second speaker, Tina Isaacs. So Dr. Tina Isaacs is also very well known and very influential in the fields of educational assessment policy, international large-scale assessments. Tina is Honorary Associate Professor at UCL IOE. And before joining the IOE in 2009, Tina worked for many years with the National Council of Vocational Qualifications, QCA, and Ofqual, primarily in the field of 14 to 19 qualifications. Now, she continues her research and advisory work in qualifications, education, assessment policy. And when we asked her for a little bio, she, in her own words, she said she has happily turned from gamekeeper to poacher, which I absolutely loved. A very warm welcome, Tina. And our third speaker is Professor Christine Harrison. Now, I have had the privilege of starting my career as educational researcher working with Chris at King's. And Chris is a professor of science education at King's College London. And before joining King's 30 years ago, Chris was a science teacher, and she worked as a principal examiner for different exam boards. She obtained her PhD under the supervision of Professor Paul Black at King's, and for which is something she's, feels very fortunate. And over the span of her career, she has been involved in over 19 research projects looking at assessment and teacher education. So a very warm welcome, Chris. And Gordon, I will ask you to start off the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I was going to say good evening, but it may be good morning, good night, who knows? It's good to see so many people from all around the globe. It's very dangerous to ask a geriatric senior citizen to reflect on the past. You run the risk of hearing the phrase, well, in my day, and then it goes on, and Mary will just have to mute me after an hour or two. So she will do that. The only good news is that for somebody from the British assessment tradition, the risk is much reduced, as so little has changed since my day. And I will be making the argument and raising the question, why has there been so little change in education? And in England, I have to make the provocative point that actually it's a case of going backwards over the last 10 to 15 years. So it's kind of back to the future. The other thing, of course, as a geriatric is the future is short. So I won't be doing too much on that. I've also developed recently, because I've been doing some work for the OECD on a comparative review of senior examinations. So I'm concentrating on examinations rather than the assessment for learning side, which will be well covered by Christine. And the comparative interest is looking at other systems of examinations and assessment, and just trying to make the point. I'm doing it for Scotland, for the Scottish government, trying to make the point that elsewhere they do it differently. There isn't just one way to do exams. There are lots of different ways of doing it. And this is because examinations are basically a cultural legacy. Whatever society in shapes the examinations. I've long made the point that the exams are not a rational or scientific endeavor. They're buried in the society. They come out of the beliefs of the society. And that's probably why they're so difficult to change, why assessment systems change so slowly, if at all. And this is partly because the politicians, teachers, parents are embedded in them. And there's the feeling this is how you do assessment. But in different countries, you do it very differently, and they wouldn't recognize each other sometimes. So it becomes very difficult to shift embedded social values and opinions. The second thing I think that prevents radical change, particularly in the British tradition, and I'm thinking here of the UK, but also legacies in Hong Kong, Singapore, elsewhere, and to a less extent, Australia and New Zealand, who have broken away from this tradition largely. And one of the key things there is the accountability system, which I think it dogs the assessment system in England. It's become the focus of it, and this is very unproductive for constructive assessment. It's been in England since the 19th century, payment by results, where teachers were rewarded for the scores on reading tests. And it's carried on. And we have probably in England the fiercest accountability system in the world that limits change. In fact, it pushes change backwards, because some of you will know that we have now basically got no coursework in our qualifications. And I think Tina will touch on this now, because we can't trust teachers to put in scores, because we're going to judge the schools, that's the accountability system, by the examination and test scores. And I'm very pleased that Gemma Moss is here, because we've just done some work on Key Stage 2 and the testing there. And I hope she'll chip in at some point this evening to see what the line there is. But we know with Key Stage 2 that it distorts the curriculum because the testing is so narrow and the like. And Gemma has now become visible. No, she's gone again. In other systems, it may be the selective pressures are so fierce that you've got to have very comparable, very reliable examinations, and that narrows the scope of what you can do. And Hong Kong has bravely tried, has bravely introduced a coursework element, but the idea of making, ensuring that it's comparable has become very burdensome for teachers and the administration. Where I want to take this, and this is the future bit, that we do see change, and what we're seeing most change in is the curriculum. And I think it's right that the Department of Curriculum, Pedagogy and Assessment, those things are brought together, because you can have an all singing, all dancing curriculum with 21st century skills, the 4 C's and all those good things. But if the assessment doesn't align with this, it won't get done. The exams will dominate. And we know this happens in many countries, and I'm looking at Scotland, where they have a curriculum for excellence that runs up to age 18, but actually it stops at 15 because people get on with the exam syllabuses at that point that bear very little relationship to it and look more like things that came out of the 19th century. I never said that, by the way. I'll have it struck from the record just in case. So how do we move forward? Well, this idea of constructive alignment, I think, is really important, that our curriculum should align with our pedagogy, and our pedagogy and curriculum should align with the assessment. And the fault line is often the assessment at the moment, particularly senior secondary exams bear little relationship to the aims, the goals of the curriculum and the like. So we may be very interested in assessment, but I think we have to win the curriculum and the pedagogy struggle as well. We say this is the kind of curriculum we want, and this is the kind of assessment we will need if we're to have this, John Biggs, this constructive alignment. And I think one of the implications of this, looking at it comparatively, and thinking of perhaps the response, the stress test that COVID has provided, which England and Scotland failed badly, that many systems didn't have the same problems because they've got a wider repertoire of assessment. And probably most importantly, there's some trust in teachers and their assessment, and that's part of the system. And we get that in North America, we get it in Queensland, and we get it in the Nordic cultures, where teachers are trusted to do assessments, and it's not accompanied by a heavy duty accountability system. And that would be true of France, I think, as well, and the baccalaureate, which is changing and introducing coursework, and not getting overexcited about school accountability and the like. So the move forward, I think, is that we've got to look at the curriculum and say, what's a valid assessment of this? And what is the role? And can we rethink the role of accountability and teacher assessment? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tina, over to you.
Right. So we said at the outset, when we were actually discussing amongst ourselves how we were going to do this, that we were going to start broad with Gordon, and then I'm going to focus in a little bit. And I think probably Chris is focusing in a little bit more. So much of what I have to say completely mirrors what Gordon has to say, which is no surprise since we came up through the ranks together from NCVQ onward 25 years ago. It might be more than 25 years. It's really scary. The other really scary thing is how many of you in this room I recognize. So I've clearly been doing this too long. Anyway, I am a historian by training. That is what my PhD is in. So I thought I'd take a little trip down memory lane. And I'm going to concentrate on the GCSEs. Which is slightly ironic because I am on the record as saying that I think that GCSEs should be either abolished completely or turned into some sort of basic measurement at age 16 of perhaps only English, mathematics, and maybe science in a kind of key stage 4 test. Or series of tests. I would prefer they were sample tests regardless, and that we not burden 16-year-olds who in essence are almost all going to continue on through some form of education until age 18 because that's the law now, not burden them with this stop-start of something that they do between the ages of 14 and 16, then stop, and then start something completely different at age 16 up to age 18. So the fact that I'm concentrating on a qualification that I think should leave us is kind of interesting. But anyway, the reason why I want to use GCSEs is partially for the reasons that Gordon was outlining. GCSEs are a good illustration of the 3 Ps. They are used to gauge performance, progression, and policy. And by policy, I mean politics. And anybody who's ever had to have anything to do with me, if you are unfortunate enough to have anything to do with me, you know that it's the politics of assessment that I'm really interested in. So performance is pretty straightforward, isn't it? We want to know how well students have learned what we want them to learn. And that's not just sort of rote learning, but the whole deep learning, social learning, the kinds of learning that we hope when they leave us at age 18 will make them good, responsible citizens of, I'm going to say the world, but certainly of wherever it is they live. Progression is also fairly straightforward, isn't it? So once we have some kind of handle on their performance, we want them to be able to get to where they want to go. We want their education to get them somewhere. Their further education, employment, both in the short term and in the longer benign Ps. The 2 Ps are quite benign. The third one is considerably less so. And that's policy and politics. And that's really about, is the government what it wants to know about how well schools, colleges, teachers are functioning, and students to a certain extent, but that's actually not, they're not the priority, unfortunately. So all that is about the accountability that Gordon was talking about. And they also want to know, politicians want to know how well we are doing compared with the rest of the world. Now, we usually use things like TIMSS and PISA and PEARLS to gauge where we are, but we also try fairly hard to compare our qualifications, especially at 16 and 18, with other people's qualifications. So I clearly believe the first 2 should take precedence over the third. But as Gordon pointed out, that is usually not the way it is. So the case in point that I'm using is how we assess students at age 16, which used to be a school leaving point, but now pretty much is just a stop along the way. So why did we ever introduce GCSEs in the first place? They were announced in 1984 by Sir Keith Joseph after about a decade of study to get us there. First teaching 1986, 35 years ago. You hardly ever bump into people who did O-levels anymore, although if you're my age, you bump into them quite frequently. And first exams were in 1988. Hi, Matt, I can see you. You did your O-levels? Yes, so some people have. Anyway, we introduced these GCSEs. We had 29 exam boards. They merged into 5 groups, and then by the 90s, they actually merged completely into the awarding organizations we've got now. GCSEs were supposed to simplify a very complex system. And importantly, very importantly, they were going to share an agreed national curriculum and national assessment standards so that a student in Wakefield, for example, fingers crossed, would be getting an equivalent experience to one in Warwick. And the GCSEs were part and parcel of the movement that introduced the national curriculum, which also came into effect in 1988. 4 key stages. At the end of each key stage, there was going to be a set of complementary national assessments. And I notice Isabel is with us, so I'm hoping she will nod her head when I say this. The impetus behind both the curriculum and qualifications movements in the late 80s were about inclusion, and they were about fairness. That seems kind of ironic today looking backwards, but that was what they were there for, to get more people in to the education system and to give them equivalent experiences. The system across all key stages was meant to be diagnostic, formative, and evaluative, even if the last has really taken over. And I just want to remind people who might not know very much about O-levels, they were aimed at the top 20% of students, and the CSEs that were introduced in 1965 were actually only aimed at the next 40%. So you have 40% of students who are pretty much written off, who cares anyway. The bottom of the ladder was just not, we just weren't particularly interested in other people's children. I would argue actually we're still not particularly interested in other people's children. But the GCSEs were aimed at 90% of the cohort. They were going to be broader than the O-level and CSE cohort. Whether or not they've succeeded in actually reaching that 90% is another question, but that's what they were there for. Now, still, even in the 80s, you can't get around promises of robust provision. Sir Keith says the system we propose will be tougher, but clearer and fairer. It will stretch the more able and stretch the average more. I can find the exact same statement from every Secretary of State for Education who came after Sir Keith. That can be your test at the end of the session, is to find the parallel sentence. But I actually don't think that the GCSEs as conceived of in the 80s were the gotcha qualifications that we have now, with all of our eggs in one basket of end of course terminal assessment. So one of the big differences, well, I should say one of the very tiny differences, keeping Gordon in mind that nothing has changed, was that most of the GCSEs had coursework. The CSEs had also had coursework. So one of the very influential reports that went into the founding of GCSEs, the Waddell report, put it this way. Coursework is assessment over a period of time by the teacher who knows the pupil. And it was found useful in searching out skills and understanding, which would be more readily tested in this way than in formal written examinations. So think about my subject, think about research in history, field work in geography, experiments in science, and then something we all do, the drafting and redrafting and then polishing of long pieces of written work in English, but in any number of other subjects, or recording improvement over time in any subject. Now, I'm not Pollyanna here. Teacher assessment and coursework has always been the subject of questioning, especially around reliability. I'm not going to get into that. I'm the last person to argue that it's perfect. And it didn't take very long before the GCSEs were codified with subject criteria and regulation, and they became less ambitious than originally seen. But on the whole, they involved a combination of externally set and marked tests with internal school-based teacher assessment. The overall assessment was supposedly criterion referenced. I'm not going to get into arguments with folks over whether they were really criterion referenced, but it was supposed to be measuring students against a set of standards rather than measuring them against each other. Again, seen as being fairer and more motivating. So I'm constantly having to remind myself that the basis of this system that we're living with now is fairness. So I'm probably going over time, so let me go through the rest of this quite quickly. Anyway, over time, assessment has shrunk down, assessment methods have shrunk down seriously, and they've hampered any flexibility or much of the flexibility that the system used to allow. Some of the early GCSEs, I like to remind myself, had 100% coursework. Not very many, admittedly, but now it's mostly 100% externally examined. Over the years, the introduction of performance tables in the mid-1990s and then the swelling of the accountability system, as Gordon has talked about, means that we've lost our faith in teachers' ability to assess their own students. And with the notable exception of the very flawed but very different, short-lived, modularized GCSEs in the first decade of the 21st century, we've cut back on continuous assessment, teacher judgment, and coursework, narrowing our evidence base precipitously, and I would argue dangerously. Coursework morphed into controlled assessment, and then it just pretty much disappeared. At least in the subjects of politicians, again, the politics of it all, consider more rigorous. It's still okay to have internal assessment in music, in art, in D&T, and in vocationally related subjects, but not the subjects that really mean something to us. So in the name of ensuring standards and rigor, we've lost teacher professional control over what's taught. And also the exam boards have suffered in their ability to be flexible and innovative. We've narrowed students' experience of a rich curriculum. And if it were up to me, this is not going to come to any surprise to anybody, I would institute a system that includes some external testing, but not at the exclusion of other types of assessment. Coursework, absolutely, but here's the one that everybody just tells me it's because I'm American. I would also I would give some weighting to unalloyed teacher judgment on what a student has accomplished over a period of time. But as long as we privilege politics over performance and progression, we are incentivizing teachers and schools to produce a rosier picture than terminal assessment might. COVID couldn't be a better example of why and how that happens. But perhaps it's the accountability system that should change, not the examination, not the progression and performance parts, and not the teacher judgment. That way we might be able to create something that's good enough to accomplish what we want our assessment systems to do. I'm allergic to theory, again, as people who know me will know, but my addition to theory is the good enough theory. We want to create a system that is good enough to do what we want it to do, because nothing is ever going to be perfect, is it? Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kat, and thank you, Gordon and Tina. Going third means that the other two already pinched a lot of my ideas. So I would try and talk for 10 minutes, but like Gordon, I can talk at length. And so, you know, maybe Kat or Mary may have to cut me off, we'll see, or mute me. So let's get going. I want to start off, first of all, just saying a little bit about where I'm coming from in terms of looking at this past, current and future look at assessment. I was a teacher for 13 years and did quite a lot of examining work, as Kat said in her introduction. I then became a teacher educator and moved into research. But I still do a lot of teacher education. I still work a lot with pre-service teachers. And so I see how teachers over time start to develop and strengthen their assessment practices. But also one of my key interests and what I've done a lot of research on in recent years is looking at how teachers conceptualize assessment and how this influences the way that they present assessment in the classroom and the way that they select assessments to do and the way that they respond to assessment, particularly at times of change. And wow, have we had some times of change over recent years? So I want to bring that in and talk about it, because I think one of the areas that really we haven't taken seriously, and to some extent that was alluded to by Tina in her talk, is we've not taken into consideration teacher agency, but also teachers' self-efficacy in terms of assessment. And I think that's important because self-efficacy in different contexts can play out differently. Sometimes it can cause tensions for teachers. At other times, it can actually result in affordances. And I think that's important to bear in mind, particularly as we're thinking about going forward. I also think the language of assessment is so key. Those of you who have maybe done a teacher training course at King's or done some work before know that I get very upset when teachers in particular, but anyone, uses terms that I think are unacceptable in relation to assessment. So, you know, when they talk about low ability classes or low ability children, I have to correct them and say, no, you mean children who've got low attainment, or children who at this stage are showing low attainment in terms of the types of assessment that you're giving them. But it also extends to the work that teachers do in classrooms with children, because the way that teachers express assessment influences how children see assessment and see themselves. Gordon's written a lot about this in the past. And one of the words that I ban in my classroom is the word marking, and that's quite difficult in a teaching context. And the reason I do that is partly because I'm a biologist at heart. That was my first degree. And I think of marking as what animals do to territories. And we don't want to do that with children's work. All right, what we want to do with children's work, as all the work on assessment for learning has shown over the years, is we want to provide guidance and advice so they can actually improve. And so you don't want to do something that puts off children doing that. You want to do something that encourages them to read the feedback you're giving them, or listen to the feedback and advice you're giving them, and then take action to move forward, so that you actually get formative action in terms of what children do, rather than them actually being affected by advice or guidance saying to them, you can't do this. We want them to be able to do things. We want them to feel that they can actually do things, a very growth mindset approach, and then we want them to do something about it. I'm also the same about the word coursework. I don't like that word at all, because I think it's got negative connotations because of the problems of accountability here in the UK in particular, or here in England in particular, over time and what policymakers have said about it. And sometimes that sort of brushes up and you almost start to believe it yourself. And I think of coursework as being the tasks that we do as teachers in our classrooms that help children with their learning and help them progress with that subject. If you look at coursework in that way, then I think you get quite a different connotation. It's not that these are some one-off tasks that they do or one-off actual pieces of work that they do. These are tasks that are part of the learning, that they come from the curriculum. A pedagogy is developed that help children to access into these tasks and help children and support and scaffold them as they move through. And then assessment is the thing that you do that either partway through is going to provide advice and guidance for those students. And when they've actually got a product at the end, whatever that product is, you then can use assessment to decide on the quality against standards. Now, we'll talk a little bit about standards in a moment. So I think getting the language right is really important. You know, I love the Carol Dweck's thing of with growth mindset is I can't do this yet, all right? No, eventually I will. You know, skating is probably the thing that I'm the worst at in the world, all right? But, you know, I can get better if I have a go at it. At the moment, I'm so bad at skating, I don't actually try and do it, so I'm not going to get better. But I like it when people say, all right, your skating's not great yet, but eventually it will be if I ever get back on the ice. So moving on, let's just think a little bit about what Gordon said. Being last to get, as well as sort of having ideas pinched, you can also ride off what others have said. And I just have to say this idea about curriculum, pedagogy and assessment, the triangle you always see in all the theoretical books. I think that's really important. I think we need to think of all three together. I would say it's a consideration rather than an alignment that we should be going for. Alignment suggests that you think of one and then think how others go with it. I think you need to have a much more sort of mutualistic approach to thinking about those three. And I think that's because validity is just so important when I think about assessment. Most people focus on reliability, and yes, we do need reliable actual assessments, but reliability is something that you can work at and improve. You can never get 100% reliable. You know, we keep telling politicians and policymakers this, but they don't seem to understand that. But they don't look at validity, which is really important. Are we really assessing things that we value within those subject disciplines? And, you know, Tina was saying about, you know, experiments in science. I'm from a science background, and the way we actually assess science in England at the moment does not actually match at all with my idea of what science is about. It's not a lot of facts that they have to learn. I don't really want to know, do they know the function of this, or can they label that? Yeah, they do have to know that the heart has got 4 actual chambers, but that's not the important thing. It's actually that understanding of how that knowledge came about and how they then apply and use that knowledge in a range of contexts that really shows me whether a child has actually got scientific understanding or not. I don't want them to be just orators of science. I want them to actually be future citizens who can use science to make decisions in their lives. That's what's important. So in order to do that, I think we have to think about assessment slightly differently to maybe what we've done in the past, or certainly how I see some teachers when I talk to them about it, thinking about it. And I think we have to see it as having a dual role. The first one is being a central role in terms of helping us decide, because of validity issues, what it is that we value, and therefore what are the best ways to actually assess that. And that's why we need to have these tasks that's part of the learning, because it's not just written exams. The terminal written exams we have in England at the moment and in many countries are not a good way of assessing, all right? They actually assess people doing things on their own, and yet most things we do in life, which we are assessed for generally, we do it in teams or in groups. It's not just individual sitting in a room doing it. You know, assessere comes from, I think, Latin, that means to sit beside, and certainly in an examination hall, when you're actually trying to fill in a written examination paper, it doesn't feel at all like your assessor is sitting beside you. It feels like they're towering above you, trying to find the gaps in your knowledge rather than to find out what you know. And again, when Tina was talking about GCSE, I was a teacher at that time when GCSEs were brought in. And I remember that purple booklet that was sent to all teachers, which was called Positive Achievement. That's what we were supposed to be doing, looking at positive achievement. And I was also a moderator at the time for London Regional Examination Board, where we actually had different styles of examination. We had mode 1, mode 2, and mode 3 examinations. Mode 1 was when the curriculum was set externally by an examination board, and the exam was set by them. Or sometimes it's an exam and coursework, but the actual assessment modes were set by them. In mode 2, you actually had used the same curriculum as everybody else was using in the mode 1s, but you could actually set your own assessments because they were more suitable for the type of student that you had in your classroom. And then mode 3s was the real go for it sort of thing, real strong teacher autonomy and teacher agency, where you could set the curriculum and you could set the type of assessment as well. And I disagree with this whole thing about comparison all the time. I think comparison alongside accountability is one of the things that's actually detrimental to the systems we've got in schools at the moment in England. Because I actually think that a child who's living, let's say, in Newmarket, will probably need quite a different science curriculum to say one that's living here in the centre of London, where I live. All right, Newmarket, racecourse, lots of horses, lots of jobs associated, stables, etc. All the agricultural work that goes on in East Anglia, they probably need quite a different science qualification and science curriculum to what we need here in central London. All right, where we don't tend to have quite so much agricultural work and so on. And I would say we need to have assessment, we should have curricula that fit with the context that children are learning and living in, and we also need to have an assessment system that matches with that. In terms of, just finishing off now, standardization, people will say to me, but you're just sort of looking into the future and saying, wouldn't it be wonderful if this could happen? But it can't. In reality, people are compared all the time. This is, our whole system is based on that. But I would disagree with that. I think that very much what we should be doing is, once we've actually set our values and our curriculum to match that, then assessment should actually, first of all, be central in deciding that, but then should be used as a servant of the curriculum and of pedagogy, so that the actual type of teaching that we have in the classroom, the actual learning experiences that students have are such that they actually help and lead towards progress. And I want to move away from an assessment system that just assesses what I have taught them as a teacher, all right? And that's an accountability way of looking at assessment. I want to move towards assessment as progress. I want to look and start from what early years teachers tell me is where we should start, and start with the child and look at the child's development, look at the experiences we're providing for them in schools as teachers, and then look at the progress that they're making and gradually build bottom up, rather than doing what's being suggested quite often, is that this is what we need at GCSE at age 16, and therefore this is what we should actually be doing with children when they're age 4 or 5. That's not the way to do it. We should not be looking forward. We should not be looking back at what is we want to happen. We should be looking forward because then the horizon is actually much more open and will fit that future world that at the moment we don't know anything about. We don't know what our young children of 4 and 5 are going to need by the time they become adults. Look how things have changed in just the last 2 years with COVID. All right, we need an assessment system that fits and can actually be flexible. And I agree wholeheartedly with what Gordon says. Assessment seems to be very conservative. It seems to be very backward in terms of curriculum and pedagogy, in terms of the way that they've moved forward. And we need to make a change. We need a revolution in assessment if we're going to get better. Evolution is useful, but revolution is what we need at the moment. And I'll stop at that point.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gordon, Tina, and Chris. It was really, really inspiring. Mary, do you want to take over now for questions?
Yeah, thank you, Katerina. And I echo what Katerina just said. That was amazing, lovely range of observations there, and lots of obviously overlap, but also lots of really thoughtful reflection. Thank you so much to our panelists for causing such a discussion on social media and also in the chat here. I've been taking account of the questions popping up in the chat. So please do keep adding. If you wish to ask a question live, you can put your hand up using the reactions button at the bottom of the screen and click raise hand. And we'll try and get to you. But I think there's obviously, like we'd expect, there's sort of themes coming out here. And let's go back to school first. And that discussion that came out of all of your points here, really, of what do you think is the will in the teaching profession to change? Do you think there's concern about the actual amount of change that's expected at the moment amongst teachers? And also that links to another question about the way that we actually educate teachers in initial teacher education programs. Do you think there should be more emphasis on the process, practice, and reflecting upon assessment? So I'll start with the speakers in the order that they came. So Gordon, if you'd like to go first, any thoughts on at a teacher's level?
Yes, a number of thoughts really, but the first one is the way we've described the system and the way it's changed. I'm thinking of England here, particularly, is that we have de-skilled teachers. And Tina mentioned the mode 1s, mode 2s, and mode 3s and things, but that was when teachers were trusted to develop their own syllabuses and their own assessment. And it may have been a bit amateurish or what have you, but it was a professional development side of things. Now, with even coursework, and I'm aware that some overseas participants are asking what is coursework, and that's typically where you set a task, a project, and then the teacher marks it, then it goes off for moderation by the exam board, and then it may count towards the final result. It's very different in other countries, in the States and Canada I'm particularly interested in. It's often the teacher is trusted to do this. It's part of the system. And what happens when, for selection, for college and things like that, a lot of other things are brought into focus, other things. So there's many strands in selection, not just grades in an exam. The same goes for the Nordic cultures as well, that teachers are trusted to do this and not heavily inspected. So I think part of it is the idea of reskilling teachers in this country, particularly. And if we are serious about the 21st century curriculum and this sort of thing, we do have to move out and assess in other ways. And it's how we can do this productively, I think, that becomes a task.
Thanks, Gordon. Tina, any thoughts on the role of teachers?
So one of the advantages of not being from here, although I have been here since 1994, is you enter into a system that is a complete mystery to you. Fact that even in the early 90s, teachers were not doing very much assessing and I think the thing that shocked me the most is that many of the teachers to whom I spoke didn't think that assessment was part of their job.
Right.
It's a cultural thing. And I think that we mistrust teachers even more than we did in the mid-90s. Gordon, you can interrupt me if you want to. Go ahead.
No,
There's an interesting,
there's an interesting case study. Sorry, there's an interesting case study from Ireland, where the junior leaving certificate at 16 is the exam there, and nobody leaves. 90% stay on. So they changed the name, but they wanted to. The minister wanted to introduce more flexible, more teacher-based assessment. And the teachers threatened strike. And so it had to be withdrawn. So there's an interesting resistance as well, sometimes, to assessing the students.
So I was going to mention that. I mean, one of the things I've been doing lately is a project on the impact of COVID on learning. And assessment, and been running. It's not shocking because I guess I expected it, but the resistance from teachers about the responsibilities that have been dumped on them. So let me, you know, if you're not expecting something to happen, it's not fair that it happens. But you know, whereas I used to speak to teachers and say, don't you feel that that assessment is who you are and what you do? And they'd say, well, no, that would poison my relationship with my students. And also assessment, we just believe that assessment should be mostly external, and we're not assessors. So there's a whole cultural shift, starting with initial teacher training. If we want, and I think we don't, politicians certainly don't, if we did want to give teachers more assessment responsibility, we really need to convince them why that's important. It is they who know their students best.
Okay, thanks, Tina.
Of judging their students.
Great, thanks, Tina. There seems to be a tiny bit of breakup. I sort of thought this might happen. Just before I come to Chris, what Gordon had mentioned, thank you very much, Zita. Thanks, Zita, who's in Dublin, has actually posted up the very same comment there on the what's happening in Ireland in the chat too. So that's really helpful kind of addition to this discussion. But I'll come to Chris. Your thoughts on this, Chris?
Yeah, I feel very strongly about this. Certainly the work that I've done on a few projects, some of them with Cat Corai actually, where we've worked closely with teachers on long-term projects about assessment, and two in particular, two European Union projects, which were, I have to say now, as somebody from England, fantastic opportunities for us and for the teachers involved, because it allowed us to work for 4 years with teachers. In fact, some of the teachers stayed on for 2 projects. So we did basically 8 years with these teachers. And what was really interesting was looking at the change in the way that they started to approach assessment when they began to really think about it and to consider the possibilities of how it worked. Now, clearly, because of the type of research I do, they were initially approaching this very much from an assessment for learning, formative assessment point of view. But they gradually came to realize over time that they had to take summative assessments, terminal examinations, etc., seriously as well, because you can't just deal with one and then say the other one's got to be external. And certainly we had one prior to these 2 projects. We had a big project in Oxfordshire, the COSAP project, working with English and mathematics teachers, where we looked at could they produce good summative assessments that were ongoing assessments throughout year 8, which is 12 to 13-year-olds, and see whether how they actually assessed that and how they dealt with it. And so we knew from that project that teachers could actually very accurately assess compared to others. We did lots of work on that, on moderation and so on, which was interesting. But what was really fascinating was this idea about subjectivity and objectivity. The teachers on that COSAP project, and certainly the teachers on Assist Me and Sales, which were our 2 EU projects, were very concerned about this whole idea about assessment being subjective. They saw that as being something that was wrong. You shouldn't have subjectiveness within assessment. And yet the whole of assessment is about subjectiveness, because it's basically about what goes on within our culture and how we actually show that we value things and try and measure or estimate that sort of value and the products and processes that go along with that. Even with sort of examinations, every year the actual examiner decides which questions kids are going to answer on which topics. It's very subjective. And although they try and sort of, make it to be comparable with previous years and so on, it can't be. I mean, I still do not understand. And I've had several arguments with exam boards over why we couldn't have, and I know it's our politicians who decided we're not going to have examinations this year in England at GCSE and A level. But I still can't understand why we couldn't just have given the kids, at GCSE 10 questions and they chose 5 to do. Because, and they're saying, well, it's because the questions aren't comparable. My answer to that is, you're the assessment experts, the exam boards, make them more comparable in terms of what the constructs are within them and in terms of how you actually award marks for various things. That can be done, all right? And they say, oh, but then, it becomes subjective. Yeah, because it is subjective. I think that the travesty we had this year with our terminal examinations here in England was that we put teachers and students through a lot of stress, and we did a terrible thing in terms of the amount of workload we put onto teachers because of what we did with this. And it's still going on, even though the teacher assessment grades had to be in by last week. It's still going on. My daughter is a media teacher in Cambridge, and she has had to rewrite her report just simply because they wanted it to be more similar to the other subjects' reports. And she keeps saying, but media is very different to mathematics and science and English. It shouldn't be the same. And we actually do this thing called coursework for some of it, and that's already been validated by the exam board. So it's going to be different, but no, she's got to actually write things in the same way as other people in other departments have about what goes on in media. So it's extra work on top of that. At the same time, I think, looking back and talking, particularly to science teachers who I do a lot of work with, that some of the moderation exercises they went through, decisions about which tasks they were going to use evidence from, was really good training for teachers. If you look back at John Gardner's work on teacher assessment literacy, he says that, over time, over the sort of from the millennium onwards, teachers have actually become a little bit better at assessment literacy, and I agree with that. What they haven't necessarily done, but I think that this move we've had with this response to COVID in England has actually improved teachers' assessment capability. So I think they're ripe and ready to go. I just think they're absolutely shattered. If there are teachers here, you're probably, I can't read my chat today, but you're probably putting rude things about me in the chat, because I think we should do a lot more professional learning events to do with assessment and to do with teacher moderation. We should be following Queensland. All right, Queensland had, in Australia, they had a long history of teachers taking on responsibility for the assessment at the end of school leaving age, built upon tasks done during the time those children were at school. And you look at some of the leading assessment scholars that are there, a lot of them come from Queensland. You've got Graham Maxwell, you've got Val Klonowski, you've got Claire Wyatt-Smith, you've got Leonora Adey, you've got Jill Willis. There's probably a lot more whose names I've forgotten. I do apologise if I've not said your name and you're from Queensland. But there it has worked. And I know somebody's going to come online and say, oh, but they're starting to do some exams now. But that's only because they want to become comparable with other states in Australia, because children are now going further than their own state to go on to university. I think, you know, we've got to really take seriously this whole idea of teacher assessment and do a lot more work, both at with pre-service teachers, but also teachers who are actually in the classroom working with it. It's the way forward, I think. Okay,
thank you very much, all three of you, for those very robust discussions. I can see there's some hands up, there's further chat here. There's a very interesting question actually that's earlier up the chat that I'd like to throw out to you. It's from Tom Howard, who's from our Centre for Holocaust Education within the IOE. And Tom asked the question, how would you advocate for the current assessment system if you were having to defend it? What is there that we can say in its defense at the moment? Because I know also there are here tonight, and I'm not saying that those of you who are here from the awarding bodies, from Ofqual, etc., you're not here to defend them. That's it. I hope that you find the discussion useful, obviously, that's coming in, and if you wish to comment too. But I think this is a really important point as well that Tom raised. And so I'll start with Tina here. If it was your job, Tina, to defend what's currently happening, what would you say?
Well, it certainly used to be my job to defend what was happening. So again, if you delete or soften, tampen down, hit over the head, the politics, the policy, the accountability part of the system, what we do isn't half bad. I mean, if you look at some of the assessments that we have on offer, there's more extended writing than many systems have. We put an incredible amount of time, effort, and energy into creating fairly creative exams as exams go. So I don't really, and Gemma, I know I hope, yes, Gemma, you are still in the room. I mean, I would actually include the Key Stage 2 assessments in those. What they are used for is vile. And the fact that it doesn't really matter to any child what he or she does on a Key Stage 2 test. And for those of you who aren't from here, those are the end of primary tests that kids have to sit in English and maths, that nobody in lower secondary pays a blind bit of difference to the Key Stage 2 test results. But the tests themselves aren't half bad. I think we are pretty good at developing assessments. So that's how I would defend it.
Thank you, Tina. No, that's good. Gordon, how would you defend it? Oh, you're on mute, Gordon. Someone had to do it. There you are.
I think back to that issue of fairness, and the whole 19th century rationale was that exams are fairer than other forms of assessment or getting job selection and that kind of thing, you know, patronage of one kind or another. And I think that theme of fairness has run right through. It sometimes gets obsessed with reliability, and that becomes the thing rather than, as we said, the idea of the validity of this. What are we assessing? Is it fit for purpose, what we're doing? But I think also we have a very professional examining tradition with examiners and chief examiners, an honorable tradition. There are other parts of the world where this is extremely difficult, and it forces exams into kind of multiple choice, machine marked, and all that. It pushes them even further away. So that's there. And I would say certainly at the kind of A-level depth, we make some good demands on students. I think we've still got linking it to our vocational qualifications. I think more needs to be said about that. Have we got some good vocational qualifications, but what is their status in society?
Thanks, Gordon. That's really helpful reflections. I've just chip in that Gemma has come back to Tina asking her,
right,
are they really defensible? Why does knowing that concept at 11 matter?
Yeah, I was actually, Gemma, I was just about to write you an answer, but I'll say it. I'm
adverbials to
yeah.
be fair,
So the changes to the Key Stage 2 tests over the last few years have been appalling, and have really, you know, taken us back to memorizing what we have to memorize up to the 13 times tables now, right? Which we, yeah. So no, I am not defending fronted adverbials. But if you look at some of the Key Stage 2 tests, say a decade ago, they really weren't half bad. Again, because of the way they're used and, you know, and have been used, that means that the fact that they exist has meant that the entire year 6 is lost to preparing for them. But that's the accountability part, isn't it? I mean, if you actually wanted to know about how our students are doing leaving primary schools, there is, I think, there could be a role for some kind of honorable, thank you, Gordon, I like that word, some kind of honorably put together assessment that is standardized up to a point so that you can get a picture, a national picture. Again, I'd be very happy with sampling the way we sample the science tests.
I know Gemma would like to
yeah, come on in, Gemma.
I would just like to pop in. Look, Gordon and I have been working on a scheme to try and propose replacing SATs, that's our primary tests, with a national sampling system. Via a national sample, you could collect much richer data if you combined it with the kind of survey data that PISA uses, and then you could use it to inform system improvement. The thing that nobody on this conversation is so far talking about is the difference that it makes, the amount of control that politicians exercise over what will be taught. And in primary sector in particular, fronted adverbials are there in the Key Stage 2 test, because politicians decided that grammatical knowledge really counted and got a grammarian who knows nothing about kids to specify some knowledge that could be tested on a repeat after me and recall basis. We've got too much political interference in the English system. And back in the day when Tina was associated with QCA, that's the Qualifications and Curriculum Authority, the Qualifications and Curriculum Authority could tell ministers where to go. That right got abolished. Standards and Testing Agency is now inside our Department for Education, and basically they do what ministers tell them. It means a minister with a preference for decodable texts in phonics, for which there is no research evidence base, can turn that into a core part of the curriculum, test for it, and then punish schools that aren't buying their accredited schemes. I mean, it is a scam, really.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that if you, as early as the 1988 Education Act, that the national curriculum is the direct responsibility of the Secretary of State for Education, legally enshrined. It is his or her responsibility, and he or she acts through the Department of Education. I find that fascinating, a little creepy, but really fascinating.
Yeah, no, thank you. So thinking about that, I'd like to, Chris, do you want to add? And then we've got Rebecca and Isabel have got their hands up.
Yeah, I'm not going to add a lot because I think there, at the moment, I think there's too many problems that need sorting for them to really show their worth of them. But I do agree that we have some very good examiners who ask good questions, and the papers have got, well, talking about science in particular and maths, which I know quite well, the questions have got better, and the actual structure of the exams have got better to what they were, say, 10 years ago. I mean, if you do Bloom's taxonomy now on, say, a science paper, you do find that there's actually is more than just comprehension and recall. You know, there certainly is some application and some analysis and a bit of evaluation. So it is getting better. I'll be happy though when we can actually have assessments within science that look at problem solving and creativity in science. You know, they are actually more interesting and possibly would engage students more in science. We want to have scientifically literate citizens of the future than maybe, you know, just having to recall the names of parts of the body or whatever.
Right. Thanks, Chris. Isabel, thank you, Isabel.
Thanks so much. At the risk of being rather unpopular, I was going to stick up for politicians. The fact is that education and health are at the heart of our lives, and we elect our politicians. The people that you don't like that have asked for these silly tests, they were actually elected, which none of us were. And the regulator in England has a statutory duty to develop qualifications that command public confidence, not confidence of educationists. And I think there is a danger of the assessment community, of which I hope I'm able to think of being part, being very arrogant and self-regarding. I went to a conference I remotely 2 weeks ago when somebody stood up and said, the problem is that we know we're right, and these people out there don't understand what we're saying. And it's a really dangerous thing. I think I would challenge us to engage with a much wider audience and put some of the points that you're making, because people know their own teachers, they know their children's teachers, and engage, because the A-levels, leaving aside the COVID experience, the A-levels and GCSEs in England are actually quite popular because of all the surveys of public opinion. So it's up to everybody here to engage in that debate in an inclusive way and not try to think that this is something for the experts to work out.
That's great. Thank you very much, Isabel. So yeah, it really is food for thought. Rebecca, did you have a comment or question on this issue too?
Sorry, I needed to unmute myself. Yes, I do have a comment that, so I work for the International Baccalaureate, but I'm actually a European continental. So, and I have worked and looked at educational systems across the continent. And I do find this, I really like some of the things that are happening, but I do think that the last bit was very much UK, very much specific to the issues there. And I was wondering, it made me feel like I didn't really have, it wasn't really relevant to me, which is a pity. I do think that Isabel, I would like to stand up for Isabel. In the Dutch situation, we actually had, so there is a complaint that maybe the politicians are holding back innovation. In the Netherlands, for 10 years, the politicians had chosen to go towards a extremely innovative way of teaching, and the teachers themselves were not ready for it. So it basically did not work out. It was an educational system that relied heavily on student agency, on students being coached by their teachers, not teaching by telling, but inquiry and all these things. And it turned out that, you know, the really capable students were getting along. Those who had needed more support were basically left in the woods. So it's not always so that politicians pressure towards conservative teaching. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it depends on which politicians you vote for. So that's my comment. So I'd like to have it a little bit broader, because it's the educational assessment group, and you were saying there are so many people from all over the world, and I get the feeling that the discussion is a bit narrow at this moment. Mm-hmm.
Of course, and I think that's the problem. Thank you. Of these sort of discussions, we kind of can easily start veering into different avenues. But obviously, going forward, we hope we can have lots of seminars where we'll have all sorts of different foci over the time. I can see that Stuart has his hand up. Stuart, would you like to have a comment? And then we'll have to. I'll have to ask for the speakers to do their sort of any closing thoughts, but Stuart.
A very quick, less a question, more observation for me. As somebody who's never taught in a school, I'm very interested in the ways in which teachers are perceived by the public, by their students, and by the parents of students and other stakeholders. And I'm wondering, in light of COVID and teacher assessed grades, it's clear that teachers in this country at least have been entrusted with an unparalleled, unprecedented level of agency and autonomy regarding assessment of their pupils. And I'm wondering what long-term effects this might have in terms of confidence in teachers, where I know in other cultures, for example, teachers are venerated.
Thanks, Stuart. I actually think that's quite an interesting point in which to ask the panelists. Sorry, because I can't believe we're already at 3 minutes to 7. That went in a moment. To have the last word each. You've got a minute each, okay? Goodness me, good luck with this from me. To say, really, what do you think is the most pressing issue in going into the future? You can take your pick. I mean, it may be the fact of the issues that we've talked about to do with teaching. It might be to do with curriculum or something else. So I'll start with Chris.
Thank you for that, Stuart. I think we can but hope. I just worry that, you know, the actual workload and effect it's had on teachers' well-being may deter teachers from continuing the good work that they've done this year in terms of teacher assessment, and maybe take Ireland's view and say, no, we're not going to do this in future. But we can but hope. I think just coming from a classroom assessment perspective, which is where most of my work sits, I want to get people, teachers and the public, possibly being more aware of how we actually start with the child and build the sorts of learning experiences that they need in an assessment system that goes with that. So recognising the funds of knowledge that children bring from their home lives, from their previous schools and from their cultural settings is taken as a serious part of it. And we move forward from there, particularly those countries like ours in the UK, which has become much more cosmopolitan over the last couple of decades.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. Tina.
So just taking it a little bit more broadly, since I don't have very much time, I think that the real challenges that are facing us that have been brought to the fore this year, but that people have been really seriously trying to engage in, are issues of trust, public trust, and trust within the system, fairness, and trying to make the curriculum and assessment and the pedagogy that goes with it as fair as possible, and inclusiveness. Those are the big challenges.
Thank you, Tina. That's perfectly put. And finally, over to Lyme Regis. Gordon, the
right.
final word.
Yeah. I'm taking Rebecca's point, and it's a fair one, that we were a bit narrow, and we could think about assessment more generally. And I think my question would be, what kind of learners is our system producing? What are all the encouragements in the system towards? And I think sometimes the assessment system is unhelpful, that we are narrowing people down. We are pushing a certain style of work because you're preparing for exams, and the countries that the jurisdictions that offer a wider range of assessment often are producing a wider range of learners and can cope with a wider, more diverse group of learners.
That's, I think, thank you, Gordon. That's a lovely way to end, to bring it back to the learner. Because I was sort of reflecting this afternoon, thinking how exciting it was to be launching this this event today. And many moons ago, I began my assessment career working at AQA in the Research and Statistics Department, and looking at a big awarding file one day, going in to help award a GCSE and set the grade boundaries. The one thing I was told by my line manager at the time was, remember when you're looking at those numbers, each one of them is a child. And it was one of the best pieces of information advice I've ever been given, to keep remembering that it's the human condition that sits behind what we do. So it just goes for me to say thank you so much to our panelists, to Gordon, to Chris, to Tina. I think we could have gone on all night, to be fair, and ranged around the world. But what this says to me is that Katerina and I have definitely made the right decision in launching this. You will certainly hear more from all of us. As I said at the beginning, if you have an idea for a seminar, if you'd like to get involved at any phase of education we're interested in, any topics, themes to do with assessment, please get in touch. We would love to talk with you, talk about it, and share that knowledge widely. Thank you all very much for logging on. Thank you to all of you who are watching this at a later date. Do keep in touch with us, and let's wait and see what happens in July this year, when the results come out. July and August, we will have to be looking globally too, to see what's happening with assessment then. It's an extraordinary time to be an assessment researcher and someone who's interested in it. So please come and join us on this new journey, and thank you all. And have a lovely evening, and take care of yourselves and those around you. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.